in this week's Talking Politics.
This is going to be the biggest historical political change this country has ever seen.
Well, the audio was terrible, but the message was clear.
Some of the polls which translate into seats think they can get 200 plus now.
The US will take over the Gaza Strip.
It's such a shocking thing for him to say.
So you've got to understand Donald Trump as the equivalent of a mafia boss.
Is the America that we have all known just gone?
The number of complaints that we got from viewers who hated my voice.
You look like a sort of 1980s pop star.
So the BBC did get me some kind of voice coach.
Hello and welcome to the show. Robert and Anushka are with me as always. How's your week going?
I'm having a great week. We've had lots of interesting chats with interesting politicians. I've done lots of running,
Okay.
which is what you wanted
That's
to know
good.
about.
I did want to know about them. When is your marathon?
End of April.
Oh, that's brutal training. How are you finding it?
Brutal. Yeah, it's quite hard.
Who are you raising money for?
I'm raising money for Bipolar UK.
Okay, good
As
cause.
you may know, I lost my brother too young. He was 37, had bipolar, was very passionate about helping people with bipolar. And this is a brilliant charity.
Yeah, fantastic.
So, yeah.
Have you ever run a marathon before?
No, it's really hard. But I guess if it's not a challenge, then I can't really ask people for money. So
Robert,
What are you up to? You're up to half marathon so far.
yeah, I'm going to be doing a 23k this week.
Ooh. I agreed to do a half marathon with my wife some years ago, the Blenheim half marathon, and we got the training schedule, and like a typical guy, I ignored it, and she did it to the letter. And we turned out, and I noticed that it's got 7 hills in it, or 6 or 7 hills. So I was slightly blindsided by that. Anyway, we're at my wife's a much better runner than me, and we're at the start line. And I say, listen, obviously, I know we agreed we'd do this together, but you're a much better runner, so don't stick around with me. And I was expecting her to say, don't be ridiculous, we agreed to do it together. And she was like,
off.
no, okay. And I was like, what? And then within about 20 yards, she'd gone like wham! And that was the last time I saw her for the next however long it takes to run a half marathon. In my case, quite a long time, 2 hours. Robert, have you ever run a marathon? Are you ever going to run a marathon? Are you a runner?
I can't bear running, actually. I think it's the most boring. I mean, I like exercise, but running, I can't bear
Get a
it.
good political podcast on and go.
I don't know. I used to, in the 90s, I did do quite a lot of running, and I once almost did the London Marathon, and then I did my knee, and so I just thought, no, never again.
Speaking of things you listen to you running, which alternative, much less good political podcast would you admit to listening to?
Well, I mean, I can tell you lots of those, but what I have just finished, which I will mention, is State Knife. Sadly, a BBC podcast. We've talked about it before, about the troubles in Northern Ireland.
This was an army agent within the IRA, within the so-called nutting squad, as they used to call it, which was the sort of internal security unit, very controversial agent, suggested that that the army basically allowed people to die to protect his identity, etc., etc.
I mean, I found the whole thing flabbergasting on both sides, and I just finished it this morning, and I put it down and I thought, that was amazing.
On the subject of podcasts, I will listen to it. We talked about watching Say Nothing on Disney Plus, which is also very good. I really would recommend The Trapped, which was our colleague Dan Hewitt's podcast.
Brilliant. And
If you're listening to this and you haven't listened to that, I really, really would recommend it. It's so gripping. I just found it so gripping. I mean, moving, enraging, frankly, but incredly gripping.
You're there with Dan as he discovers the absolutely horrifying state of housing in this country.
But I just thought it was a brilliantly paced story. It was just a really wonderful piece of storytelling. And it really took, you might think, how can you make a, whatever it is, 8-part series on 10-part series or whatever it is on housing, you'll lose the way halfway through, but I really felt like you didn't. You were with him every step of the way, and it was really, really good. Anyway, look, we should talk some politics. We'll be taking a trip down memory lane later in the show. Stick around for that. But let's start by talking about the continued rise of reform. Have a listen to this.
We really will surprise everybody come that next general election when we win it. This is going to be the biggest historical political change this country has ever seen.
Well, the audio was terrible, but the message was clear. Nigel Farage says Reform are on course for victory. And of course, we've had an opinion poll out this week that for the first time has put them ahead by 1 point and well within the margin of error. But still, it's a moment to have them ahead in a poll. What do you make? Do you read anything into them being ahead in this first poll, or do you just think it's kind of irrelevant so far from an election?
Oh, definitely not irrelevant. I mean, the rise of Reform is unbelievably striking. They're getting much more organised in terms of how they translate that into actual seats. There is no reason to think that it wouldn't carry on in that direction. Robert and I have just recently been speaking to some quite senior people in the party who are quite involved in that transformation, and they're very, very serious about it. The one thing I would say is it's all very well getting 30+% in the polls. We have a system, first past the post, that makes it quite hard to translate that into seat wins. They absolutely think that they can do that, and we've seen that the Labour Party in the last election almost appeared to do magic by turning 34% into this unbelievably large majority. But it's going to take something to, jump that next bit of the hoop. The Lib Dems have struggled with it for years and years and years. In 2010, they actually hit 30% in the polls as well. They did incredibly well with young people in 2010. This time they actually did get the same number of seats as proportion, but it's a hard thing. The one thing that is interesting, which I've talked about before, Nigel Farage has studied the Lib Dems to look at how you do that extra jump. And they know that this polling in itself is not enough.
If my memory, just come to that in a second. But if my memory serves me correctly, Robert, like when we were at the height of Clegg mania, just after the debate in 2010, wasn't Clegg on 50 points in the polls? And we thought that,
the Lib Dems were 30. His personal ratings probably weren't very high.
Yeah, his ratings were high. I mean, look, I think there are a number of reasons why, if you are Labour or the Tories, you have to be concerned about this. I mean, what you would focus on is social media, the extent to which that has transformed the prospects of any insurgent party. Wasn't around, frankly, for Clegg and Clegg mania, and they appear. I mean, I don't think we need to pretend who we met earlier this week. It's this bloke called Zia Yusuf, who is their chairman. And what's interesting about him, he's a Muslim. He made a lot of money from building a tech business, which he sold. And he does not look like most people think Reform looks like, as it were. He's not a white, middle-aged man, and he wouldn't describe himself. I mean, he describes himself as somebody who's always been on the centre-right. And so when you look at somebody like him and you see that he's serious and he's trying to build a national campaigning machine, at that point, you have to, whoever you are, you have to say this is a party that is intent on becoming more than just the personal vehicle of a particularly charismatic individual in the shape of Nigel Farage. And it's not just the rise of social media associated with all of that. We are living through a period of the breakdown of traditional party loyalties. Party loyalties are more fragmented. And what Reform would looking at, is that Labour wins a landslide with a bit more than 32% of the vote, something that actually in the old days all of us would have thought of as unthinkable. And so they are taking the view that they can learn from the so-called efficiency lesson of Morgan McSweeney, who led the campaign, which is if they can get 33% in the right if they can distribute the 33% national share in the constituencies where they've got a chance of winning, if they can focus the vote on then they too can win a majority. And so it does mean that even if you struggle to see how Reform could get more than, let's say, 33% of the national vote, and I think many people would struggle, you cannot assume that at the next election, and they are literally intent on building for the next election, you cannot assume that they'll be humiliated. You have to assume at the moment that they will get a significant number of seats, and they think on the margin they could win. Even
some of the polls which translate into seats think they can get 200 plus now. But the efficiency thing is difficult, and it requires a party like Labour having a huge base across the country. So reform has to build that base in not much time. But, I was with a cabinet member yesterday. They don't think we're definitely going to win in 2029. They think not just because of the rise of reform, but because of this volatility question. Voters don't act like they used to act. Actually, a smaller and smaller minority of voters say we're always going to vote Labour or we're always going to vote Conservatives. I do think reform are helped by the Conservatives' woes at the moment, and that could change.
As you know, on the show, we're doing the talking, but we want you to ask the questions. So please do email us on talkingpolitics@itv.com and get us talking about the things that matter most to you. The big news story, unquestionably right now, is Donald Trump's new plan, if indeed that is what it is, for the Gaza Strip. Here's a bit of what the US president announced while hosting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site. Do a real job, do something different, just can't go back.
We often say with Donald Trump, concentrate on what he does, not what he says. What he says is not necessarily what he means. What he says is not necessarily actually what he wants. I personally think, listening to this, we should take him absolutely seriously, partly because it came in the context of a meeting he had with the Israeli Prime Minister. We certainly know that many of, or at least some of Mr. Netanyahu's cabinet specifically want Gaza to be cleared out of the Palestinians, or the Palestinians to be forced to leave Gaza, which would be ethnic cleansing. What did you, and the Israelis control Gaza effectively at the moment. It might be difficult for them to completely take over in the eyes of the world, but if the Americans decide to step in and effectively facilitate it, whatever, I mean, that's a whole different thing, no?
Well, I definitely think we should take Donald Trump seriously, because this time round, much more than last time round, he is following through on everything that he has said he is going to do before coming into power. So it looks as though he tries to mean what he says, but also it's such a shocking thing for him to say. Obviously, it's led to international condemnation. It's a difficult issue for the UK government, politically, domestically, as well as in terms of how the hell do you square our position, which is we want a two-state solution, and there will be no thought whatsoever that you would further displace Palestinian people. You would rebuild Gaza, and then you would want people to be able to go back to their homes. And what Donald Trump is saying, the one thing that I'm confused about is, I said to somebody in government, doesn't this derail potentially the ceasefire? And they said, well, Donald Trump's completely committed to the ceasefire. Many of his team went over to the Middle East and were really heavily involved in it. That's definitely not what he wants. But obviously, this is going to put huge pressure on the ceasefire, which we already know is pretty fragile. The press conference was one of the most shocking press conferences, certainly by any Western leader that I've ever watched. You have to sort of, look, the practicalities are enormously challenging. He wants to relocate hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to Jordan and Egypt. Jordan and Egypt are saying there's no possibility of us doing that. So you've got to ask yourself quite how he intends to move all these Palestinians. He equally claims that it will not be forced removal. But what is he going to do? Is America? Well, he kept referring to the enormous wealth of the surrounding countries, in particular Saudi. But, can you conceive of a situation where Saudi is going to chuck a ton of money at relocating these people?
What you could conceive of a situation is that the war breaks out again, and the Israelis, now with Trump in the White House and now with whatever Netanyahu and Trump have privately discussed, decide to effectively clear out Gaza of Hamas, in inverted commas, as they might.
But where do you clear them out?
Well, you push them into Egypt. You push them. That's what they moved them around last time, didn't they? They were enormous, movements of the population all over the place.
But the point Robert's making is is really important, which is that Egypt and Jordan have said no, they're not going to allow that. So,
but what are they going to do if they're forced over the border or they're forced into a camp on the border? I mean, this is diabolical stuff.
Well,
I'm not trying to pretend
there
it
are
isn't.
already millions of Palestinians who have been displaced.
Of course.
Huge numbers in Jordan in particular. And those countries are rightly saying, well, it's not, you know.
But also,
by the way,
to get back to the UK just for a second. Okay.
No, can I just talk about the UK in a minute? I just want to talk about it because the other thing he said, unless I misinterpret it, was he also said that he was going to rule on, or was going to give his view later.
On the West Bank,
Yeah, on the West Bank, and whether those Israelis who say that, you know,
this should be Israeli territory.
That it should be Israeli territory. Now, I mean, we think Gaza's one aspect of it. If he ends up coming out and saying, yes, I think Israel really should control the West Bank, it's really Israeli sovereign land, that would be
he did
even, you know, as extraordinary, but
he did immediately lift sanctions on, you know, action by those in the settlement.
He did. I mean, one of the very first things he did. I mean, Biden, like the UK, actually did impose sanctions on the more extremist of the settlers in the West Bank, and Trump has removed those sanctions. We haven't yet, but you know, all the signals are that he will back the ambition of the far right in Israel to take control of the West Bank as well. And you know, this is, I mean, sorry to raise the UK, but you know, this is stuff that absolutely, people say that, you know, Keir Starmer doesn't stand for anything and he's got sort of contradictory views on lots of different things. And you know, there's a fair amount in that, particularly when it comes to generating growth in the economic programme. But the one thing we know he stands for, more than anything else, is the international rule of law. You know, it's characterised his entire life. So can he really, you know, basically react to this by simply trotting out platitudes like we believe in the two-state solution and the international rule of law without directly confronting the American president, and essentially trying to build a coalition of opposition?
But I wanted to ask about that, but I actually wanted to ask a bigger question around it, which is what we appear to be looking at in Gaza, what we appear to be talking about in Gaza is unquestionably the ethnic cleansing of an entire people of 1.8 million who are going to be forcibly removed from their homes and forced to give up their land. I mean, that's just an invasion by any other term. We've also got the possibilities we've just been discussing. You know, the settlements in the West Bank are illegal under international law. I was in Hebron about a year ago, sort of wandering around them, and it is quite extraordinary to witness what's going on in there. Obviously, Israeli says it's a matter of security for them, but the idea of effectively Donald Trump legitimizing extremist Israelis' claims to that land would be another huge transgressive step. So my question is really, is the America that we have all known all of our adult lifetimes just gone? And is the British government and Keir Starmer going to have to accept that in our eyes there really isn't that much difference between a Russia and a China and America? If this kind of thing goes ahead, what will be the difference? And how do we as a country respond to that?
I mean, look, you raise the question of the moment. I mean, there is. I was talking to a very respected British official the other day, and this person said it's now increasingly clear that Donald Trump is you've got to understand Donald Trump as the equivalent of a mafia boss. Right, and you've got a mafia boss in Putin, and arguably you've got a mafia boss in Xi Jinping. And it is all about them taking control of particular, in a sense, in the case of mafia, it's often property and businesses. In their case, it's land and territory. And, you know, this person was saying you've got to see the tariffs as essentially the extortion payments, as it were. And so I was just posing the question, right? If you accept essentially that vision of the new world with these sort of essentially three mafia bosses trying to control their own spheres of influence, how then does Europe behave? How does Europe deal with all of this. It's incredibly challenging, and it's not a world any of us have inhabited before.
Although the reason that British Prime Ministers, one by one, appear to suck up to US presidents involves obviously an economic relationship that is important to us, but also, and again, we don't know the truth of it, but also when you talk to people, when you become Prime Minister and sit down, one of the first things you do is see behind the curtain, if you like, and you understand much more our intelligence relationship, including, financial relationship within that could affect us if we were to pull away from America. And people who have worked in those sort of environments always say when you get in there, you understand the reason why you can't have your moment.
But this is why this precise discussion is arguably the most important topic that I feel like I've ever debated in 35 years as a working journalist. Because for all, I grew up in the old Cold War. My dad was posted to the British Embassy in Bonn when I was 12 years old. I remember going through Checkpoint Charlie, going into the East. And the whole of all of our upbringing was predicated on the idea that America, for all its flaws, was the leader of the free world, and it would always stand for freedom, and it would always stand for democracy, and it would always stand with us, and it would always stand with Western Europe. And as communism broke down, that seemed to matter more than ever. The whole shining, city on a hill and all the rest of it. And the truth of the matter is, as Robert was just saying, we're now potentially looking at a different America, and if it's debatable how far it's going to go, but if it does go to the extent of ethnically cleansing people or supporting the ethnic cleansing of people, of giving land that rightfully belongs to a people to someone else in defiance of all international law, I just don't see how fundamentally they will be any different from Russia and China, and therefore I don't really see what we will have in common with them. And I'm just kind of interested to know, well, how is Keir Starmer thinking about that? Because that's the most fundamental question to confront any British Prime Minister for probably 40 years.
I think we said when Trump was coming in, it's sort of brace yourself, because who knows what's going to happen. They want to retain that relationship, but with every day, there is something that challenges that, whether it be the threat of tariffs or now something which on a foreign policy level is incredibly difficult for Keir Starmer. And it might seem like a small part of this, but also politically for him and personally for him, because he has a party which has a huge number of people for whom this is a massive motivating factor. I was speaking to an absolute Keir Starmer loyalist yesterday, but who's really worried about Gaza, and who was telling about Labour's position on Gaza, and who was telling senior other MPs who are quite close to Keir Starmer, you better be careful because you might lose your seat over these issues if we do not get this right. And, I was making a documentary with Keir Starmer when October the 7th happened, and it wasn't that long after that when he had, as you might remember, messed up on an LBC interview about suggesting that Israel had the right to stop food and water going into Gaza. And I spoke to him a lot over that period. And what I think the conclusion he had come to through that period was, you have to be so, so careful with everything you say on this. So what they're not going to do is suddenly come out with something big today, but they will be absolutely consumed with conversations behind the scenes about how you handle this.
I mean, look, for some weeks, I've been saying that Starmer's position, which he repeated only, I think, yesterday, or was it the day before, at that NATO press conference, which is that we don't have to choose between Europe and America. He trots it out repeatedly, and he said it again just the other day. But equally, as I've said, his entire life has been dedicated to both the domestic and the international rule of law. And I just don't see how, with this provocation, right? The US president said overnight that international law doesn't matter, we will take control.
I think we are going to have to choose.
So I'm saying he's going to have to.
I think
he's going to have to choose.
More than that, I think we'll all have to choose as a country, and I think it might split the country because people on the right, the people inclined to vote reform, perhaps people inclined to go vote for will opt for America, and we'll be very angry if we start turning our back on America. And a lot of people who are in the centre or on the left are going to say, well, listen, we've got nothing in common with them anymore. We've got a lot in common with Europe. We should turn back to Europe and take that seriously. But I wanted to ask you one final question on this is, let's say we did that. Let's say that's the decision Keir Starmer says, we just can't tolerate this. There's just no point in sucking up to Donald Trump anymore. It's not getting us anywhere. He's just going to keep doing incredibly transgressive things. We've got to say what we think about it. What could be the consequences of that for us? If he decides to impose tariffs, if he decides, honestly, stuff you Brits, we're going to make life really difficult for you, what would be the net consequence for us in reality?
So it depends precisely how he decided to punish us. If it was simply tariffs on physical exports, it's a pain in the arse, but we could cope with it. Our big trade with America is through services, it's legal services, it's consultancy, it's banking. If for whatever reason he decided to try and hurt us in that way, that would be more serious. I mean, all I would say is we do have leverage. The most extraordinary thing about Donald Trump is apparently how much he absolutely loves the royal family. I mean, it's a real thing, right? He definitely wants this bloomin' state visit. He wants to go to Buckingham Palace. He wants to hobnob with the king. And so, I know this sounds mad, but he is, he is an emperor, right? He's not a classic Democrat, and he wants, all right, but even the mafia bosses, he wants to be taken seriously. He wants to be feted, and so it's weirdly, and I always sound mad saying this, right? But you've got to try and think to yourself, why hasn't he, given what Musk says about Keir Starmer, given what Donald Trump knows are Starmer's values, why is he, relatively speaking, being nice? It's all about the it's all about the state visit.
You wouldn't want to be the King and Prince William if he comes here on a state visit, having to work out what to say to him in private about all this stuff.
But that's why we pay them, right?
Let's change the tone for a moment. There is one final thing we want to talk about before the end of the show. But before we do, have a quick listen to these three people.
Well, I think that the Serious Fraud Office can regain the confidence of the public by doing what it's doing at the moment, which is to behave in a slightly more professional way than perhaps it was initially.
And I have to say, I think that his package of measures is bold and over the medium term may work.
I might not be Prime Minister, but I've got my feet up and it's lovely. And I'm in this luxury hotel. And Theresa, hope you're having a nice time. Where is their ambition? What makes them a Labour government? Why do they want this economic growth?
If Mr Major eventually goes on to win tonight, it will be one of the most remarkable political turnarounds.
This inauguration day will see Donald Trump re-enter the greatest office in this land.
I thought you were going to play a
I missed that hair in my case, actually, I have to say.
I was so young.
Now listen, if you're listening to this rather than watching, what you will have missed was Robert's crazy hair, which and you look like a sort of 1980s pop star, I'd say. Anushka, he was a 1980s pop star. Anushka, kind of looking and sounding kind of the same, I would say.
And the voice had changed.
I look about 12 years old in 1997, and that's being polite. Bad haircut. Yes. Well, why do you think we're...
Because we're talking about voice training.
We're talking about how voices
Which, by the way,
might change.
Isn't it interesting how all our voices got a little bit more serious and deep in time, even without our voice trainers?
None of us, I think, are sort of heavy smokers.
No.
And we've never had voice training, I think it's fair to say. So let's just take a look at Keir Starmer, or a listen to Keir Starmer, to see what his voice has done over the years.
I do think it's time that the court system became much more of a place where the ordinary person feels they can go.
It is the honour and the privilege of my life to be elected as leader of the Labour Party. this must now be a moment to think again about the country we want to be.
I don't think it's changed that much.
So I don't know.
How much did he spend on the voice
I think
trainer?
my voice might have changed the most, actually, possibly, from very bad to only slightly less bad. What do you make of this whole story about the voice coach, and why did he have a voice coach? Did he need a voice coach? Has his voice chosen? And then we'll talk about the so-called lockdown breaking rules.
I mean, just on the should you have one, do you have one? I mean, look, as a politician, everything you're doing is very public facing. It really matters what people think of you. If there are things that you need to do to make people think of you better, I don't think that is unreasonable. I mean, obviously, who pays for it is quite interesting, which is why he got in trouble with all his free suits, which was part of the same idea. How do you make him look better? And actually, the middle one of those clips, which I think was when he first became leader of the Labour Party, he had a problem with his voice in that.
He was pretty speaking, robotic to begin with as well.
Very much so. That
of course, he's not robotic at all these days.
That said, if you speak to Keir Starmer off camera, he doesn't have a weird voice, he doesn't have a weird style or tone. And what really we want from politicians is for them to speak publicly like they speak privately. And whether or not you need a voice coach for that, I think maybe something else.
I mean, so there's a few things here. I mean, I'm pretty sure that Margaret Thatcher had a voice coach.
Yes, she did.
And I think it's also possible that Her Majesty the Queen had a voice coach at some point. Certainly her voice changed massively over the course of life. So I don't think there's anything unusual about people in public life having voice coaches. I mean, this story came up largely because there was a question about whether he should have had the coaching, during a period when there was lockdown, when there was COVID lockdown, in effect, whether or not this was an appropriate work meeting and whether they were both really key workers.
Because she travelled from Brighton to London at a time when London was in Tier 4, Brighton was not, on Christmas Eve, and is a voice coach a key worker? That was her claim. And the Tories are trying to now make waves on it, and we did have a question in PMQs.
Well, I think it was raised twice in PMQs, and actually, and Kemi nodded to it. I mean, my own view is that the politics of it are terrible for the Tories, because all that it does, I think, when they raise it, is remind people of the parties in Downing Street and the fact that two Tory prime ministers, were found guilty and breaking the rules and fined. And so, I mean, look, I think it's perfectly reasonable for people to know the truth of what happened on this occasion. I suspect that because he is so meticulous, that he won't have broken the rules.
It is.
Some people won't.
I suppose. I just think, is the moment now? The Tories are pushing it hard. Richard Holden's pushing it hard, who's the same MP who pushed it hard about whether or not Beergate was against the law when Keir Starmer had a beer in a Durham constituency office. I think that's the right place anyway, when it was during the Hartlepool by-election. And given that went so badly wrong for the Conservatives, because Labour obviously, both he and Angela Rayner said that they would quit if they got a police fine, and they didn't get a police fine. I do think it's a little bit weird that they're bringing it up now. It shines a light on their own behaviour, and also I don't think now people are thinking about COVID breaches in the way they were then. The one thing I would say is Labour really attacked the Conservatives on all of these points, and so in a way they've opened themselves up to attacks back. And although he obviously wasn't fined for Beergate, a lot of people, and I've spoken to legal people about this, would say that the Boris Johnson fine, which was over the cake in the cabinet room, that they were not dissimilar events, and that it could, that there was a kind of comparison between them, that makes it fair.
I think that's fair enough. I mean, I guess I would say that I imagine what the Tories are hoping to land is not really the whole lockdown thing. It's a bit, Keir Starmer behaves a bit weirdly around this stuff thing. It goes into the same category as the designer sunglasses and the suits, and you're deeming a speech coach as a key worker on Christmas Eve,
which is a bit weird.
Which is a bit weird, and even if it was technically within the rules, it's like, Really, a voice coach is
also it's
you
that
want to go to the war with
It's also
her
that
as a
he's like
key
a
worker.
bit holier than thou about sticking to the rules, and so when it looks like he's not sticking to the rules, it starts to look a bit, hypocritical.
But if he was getting, drunk, if he was getting, drunk with a voice coach or having an uproarious party, you might say that was a scandal. I mean, as you say, it's just most people will just say. Why did you need a voice coach on Christmas Eve? I think, and it's a bit strange.
But to most people, it wouldn't be an issue. I'm just saying because Keir Starmer has so much been, I'm the guy who sticks to the rules, and I'm attacking you for. No,
but I have got to make.
He opens himself up to that.
So I have got to make one final important disclosure because you made an assumption about me. So when I joined the BBC back in early 2006. When I first started broadcasting, the number of complaints that we got from viewers who hated my voice, right, was just off the charts.
What did they say?
They just hated the way I sounded. And so the BBC did get me some kind of voice coach, who I think then basically moved to another career because this particular voice coach was unable to make it. So what actually?
Your voice hasn't changed. Sorry, your voice hasn't changed.
No, it's just I think what happened was broadly that after a certain point, people thought actually what he's saying might be worth listening to, and they stopped thinking about the way that I said it. So, but I have got it. So full of break disclosure, as I say, I don't think it made any difference whatsoever to my performance. But they did get me a voice coach in.
This is a final point. One of the weird things about broadcasting is that often kind of bosses want you to go into a kind of box so that you're kind of polished and look and sound like everyone else. But of course, it's your points of distinction that people tend to remember. And I remember, I can't really say who, but somebody who shall remain nameless, who was very senior when I was trying to become political editor, said, listen, I think you'd make a good, this is like way back in the day, I think you'd make a good political editor, Tom. But here's the thing, John Cole had his herringbone coat, and Andrew Marr has his ears, and Nick Robinson has his glasses. What have you got?
His glasses?
Yeah. And I was like, well.
Oh, Tom, you've got so much. But just can I just say
that's very nice. But it was kind of like, I'm just going to be myself, and some people will like it, and some people will hate it. And that, but,
totally right. And the key thing about having, initially at least, and probably still do, an eccentric voice, is people do know
you, Robert. No one would ever say
you are.
Everybody, I mean, it's always like, tell Robert this. Occasionally about your voice, but not always.
But so people know who you are, and I have to say, quite along with the. The sort of, some of the slightly annoying complaints from the odd listener and viewer. I was regularly caricatured by the likes of Rory Bremner, which I regarded as a badge of honour.
Do you know, I've been doing News at 10 years, and obviously one of the things about doing that is a lot of people come up to chat to you about stuff, and there's various things I've noted about that. One of them is it's like I've occasionally been somewhere with someone really famous, like a film star or a royal or whatever, and people behave in a very weird way. It's sort of very kind of like, oh my God, I love what you do, blah, blah, blah. And I don't know whether you both find this, but when you're in the news, it's a bit like meeting your dentist, and people are just like completely familiar with you, and they always start a conversation like they've had a conversation with you before that was interrupted halfway to be like, they'll come up and say, wow, that blooming Keir Starmer, eh? And you're like, sorry, have we met? My name's Tom, blah, blah, blah. And the other thing they always say, they say, yeah, blah, 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 this, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, and Robert Peston. And I'm like, well, yeah. And they're like, well, yeah. I'm like,
oh dear.
Anyway,
can I just make one final point on voices, which is I think it is a different thing for women than for men. And I think,
in what way?
Well, I think that if you have a higher voice, and I used to present a podcast as my main job, and I really thought about this as well. I think if you have a higher voice as a woman, for some reason, it's seen as less authoritative.
Interesting.
And so I think it's a sad reality of it that I think you'll notice, and I think I did do this, although you said you didn't notice it as much, that women tend to drop their voices to try to sound a little bit more authoritative, and I don't think men get the same issue.
But don't you think that often when people start out in broadcasting, particularly if they come in from newspapers, there's this sort of thing that everyone, as I said, tries to ram them into this sort of square peg. And fundamentally, if I asked our audience about you two, I'm pretty sure the single most important thing they do, they really know what they're talking about. And I think if you know what you're talking about, then people fairly quickly get beyond and they become accustomed to you, and that's
why we keep going. Basically, we tell ourselves that, don't we?
Anyway, okay, that's it for this week. We're in danger of being nice to each other. That will never catch on. I won't be here next week, I'm afraid to say, but the show goes on. And each week you can, of course, catch up on everything on the Talking Politics podcast, available on your favourite podcast platform and on the news section of ITVX. But for now, from all of us here, modern voices and all, goodbye.